Sunday morning here in Durban, South Africa, and I'm excited to continue our journey in the book of Exodus. Today we're going to be having a look at some very curious findings within the book of Exodus, some really strange little bits, and we're getting closer and closer to the actual plagues where the real action is happening, although this is like pre-fight action, but eventually we'll get to the place where the real fight starts. And as we've said before, this fight is not just a fight between Moses and Pharaoh. It's actually a fight, and it's written to be a fight between God, Yahweh, Lord of the universe, and then the gods of Egypt. And that's going to become clearer as we delve into the plagues. Not quite today, but plagues will probably be in our next session. All right, so let's get going. By the way, I just realized that I've been wearing the exact same shirt for the last 3 sessions. And that's not because it wasn't washed in between or because I recorded them all in directly after each other. I guess subconsciously light blue is my favorite color, and I just keep on, if it's there, I pick it. Anyway, I've got another shirt on today, so just so you know, I have more than one shirt at my disposal. All right, so just a very brief recap of last week. Last week we had a quick look at the different names for the father-in-law of Moses, which is a strange phenomenon, together with the different names, 2 different names specifically, for the mountain of the Lord, Sinai. And we mentioned that scholars believe that the reason why we have different names for the same things is not because one author is trying to confuse us or trying to show his breadth of knowledge, but rather we have multiple traditions working together. And I think today, once again, this will come up, and I will mention it every single time it comes up, because this is one of the most important things I think we have to realize when we're dealing with a book like Exodus, is we are dealing with multiple traditions. And that goes against our tradition of viewing it as a book written by one person, namely Moses. Once you can get your head around that, I think for the first time you can read Exodus for what it says, and not for what our tradition tells us it says. All right, so we did that. We also met the mountain of the Lord. So in the spot very close to Midian, which is all the way on the eastern side of the Sinai Peninsula, is the land of Midian, where Moses' father-in-law was a priest of Midian, a priesthood that existed before the Levitical priesthood. And in this area, there was a very special mountain. It's called a holy mountain. And there's a bush on this mountain, and there a God, let me tell the story in sequence, makes himself known to Moses. And eventually when Moses asks him, "Who are you?" this God makes himself known to be the God of Moses' fathers. I mean, what a coincidence that he has to travel all the way to Midian, a pagan land with pagan priests and probably pagan gods, and there, Bob, on a mountain, is the God of Moses' fathers. But this is what the story tells us. He meets this God. This God introduces himself and says, "I've got a mission for you. I need you to go back. I need you to go get the Israelites because they are mine. They come from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and they are mine. And I've come now to deliver them. And there's going to be some serious action." Moses, of course, is reluctant. But God just keeps on hammering in, like, "Look, I'll be with you. Here's some signs." Gives him a terrible sign, and then later on a little bit of a better sign. Tells them that, okay, you can throw your staff on the ground, it'll become a snake, and you can put your hand in your cloak and it'll become leprous or plagued, and you put it back and it'll be healed. So Moses got some confidence, and he is now ready to go back. And first off, he has to face the elders of his people. He has to convince them because there's no point in him convincing Pharaoh that they should leave, and then nobody wants to go. So first order of business is you need to go back and you need to go convince the elders of Israel. And then you need to go and convince Pharaoh. Now, this is a huge task because the Israelites are slaves, and the subjugated peoples do not get to make the rules in the ancient times. The sovereigns make the rules. And believe me, Pharaoh of that time, of which name the story doesn't tell us, was a sovereign and a ruler, a mighty ruler of that time, the ancient empire of the great Egyptians. And of course, this is long after, as far as I remember, speaking under correction, but this story is supposed to play off long after the pyramids are built. The gods of the Egyptians are thousands of years old. Like it's at least 1,000 years these gods have already been worshipped. And now for someone to come from the slave nation and say, hello, our God is Yahweh, and he says, let us go. A sovereign's not going to bow to that. So this is where we are in the story. We also had a very brief introduction of Aaron, and a very peculiar introduction of Aaron. It'll be re-emphasized in today's session, that God says to Moses, you know Aaron the Levite. Like Moses doesn't know that Aaron is a Levite. It's weird, and most of the scholars say that this is particularly said in this way because this book acts as a legitimizing of the, or legitimization of the Aaronic or the Levitical priesthood that came into being later on, and this would be used as a proof text for why Aaron and his family needed to be the high priestly line in Israel. All right, so let's move on to session 5 today. And we're moving to, if you're following in the book of Exodus, now I would suggest you read these chapters on your own again afterwards. Specifically, after today, there's one portion that really stands out and you kind of have to go and look at it for yourself. But we're continuing in chapters 4 to 6 today of the book of Exodus. So Moses needs to leave Midian, and he can't really bring himself to tell his father-in-law what he's about to go do. Like, you can understand that the father-in-law probably advised against it. So he kind of just says, look, I need to leave. I need to go see how my family is doing. It's weird that he can't really stand up to Jethro and tell him like a man what he's about to go do. And I'm not sure why he does that. But the question is big then, why? How can he stand up to Pharaoh if he can't even speak truth to Jethro? So in verse 19 to 20, there is a lot of discontinuity, it seems. After the lengthy conversation at Sinai, and after Moses finally leaves Jethro to go back to Egypt, verse 19 seems to go back a few steps, and God commands Moses, like for the first time, go back to Egypt, for all those who are seeking your life is dead. Now, number one, that seems to be an unnecessary repetition of the commands he's just received. Well, why, after he decides to go, God is to tell him again, go back to Egypt? Interesting. The second thing is the motivation. God tells him go because those who are seeking your life is dead. Like it's somehow now going to be easier or better. It's a little bit strange and a little bit disjointed. And as we've mentioned many times before, the reason for this, scholars believe, and it becomes apparent to even us lay people, that these are multiple traditions that are being put together, because for the editors of Exodus, these portions, the calling of Moses, they belong together. And if you have more than one version, you're not going to be popping the second version somewhere else. You're going to be popping it in with this version at this point, even though that might create what is called in science a literary seam. So if you're a seamstress and you putting two pieces of material together, it creates a seam, right? And you have to sew the seam together. So in literature, we find things that are called literary seams, and these are normally indicators that we're dealing with two pieces of literature that's put together. And that often happens when there's a discontinuity, and we're going to two portions, repetition, unnecessary repetition of material, and often contradictory repetition of material. And as I've said before, it just seems like the editors were more concerned with preserving the multiple tradition, much more than what they tried to get the exact story straight. And I think we need to appreciate a bit of what we're dealing with here in the ancient world. Not everyone can read and write. This wasn't, not everyone can just sit down and write something down. Whenever there was a writing project, it had to be funded. People gave their life to it. It was the absolute elite and those who've been trained in it. So when they decided, let's write down Exodus, this is like, okay, bring the oral stories. We don't want these stories to go or to disappear in the course of history. We want them written down, and we have multiple accounts of the calling of Moses. What do we do here? We're not just going to choose one. We're going to put both of them in together because it's we want both of them to be preserved for posterity. So I think we just need to, think a little bit about what it would have been like in that time. It's very different than what it would be like today. Today, if someone was writing a story of the history of a nation, they would sift through the information and only write down what they believe to be plausibly historically true. That's not what's going on in the book of Exodus, Genesis, and in fact the entire Torah. So we are possibly dealing here once again with multiple voices, multiple traditions, oral traditions in these sections. And so verse 20 also stands very much in tension with verse 21. This is of chapter 4. Because Moses, it says, Moses took his wife and his sons and he put them on a donkey and he went back to Egypt, right? And Moses carried the staff of God in his hand. So everything seems great. Okay, so Moses, he's been told again that he needs to go back after he's busy going back. All right, now he's really going back. His children are on the donkey. His wife is there and, they busy walking. Now, geographically, we're talking about almost 300 kilometers back to Egypt. Now, you can only walk so many Ks in a day. You could do 40 Ks in a day. That's pretty good. With a donkey and kids, I'm not sure if you could even do that. So we're talking about 6 days, 6 to 7 days to get back. But in verse 21, then Yahweh tells Moses, when you go back to Egypt, and then follows with a whole bunch of instructions again, again? He's already going. It's talking as if he never went. And so this is almost the third time now that we see, it's like a third tradition that's popping its head up here. Moses gets his instruction, starts going, and then God says, okay, when you go, all right. And then he starts going. It's obviously literary seams putting multiple traditions together, and that's why it reads in such a disruptive, jaggedy way. Now, I recall reading these portions and thinking, what in the world is going on here? Why is it being repeated so much? And never thought anything about it and just went on. Today, I understand a little bit better about what's actually going on in these portions. So these type of okay, let's just go back. Interestingly, when we go then to verse 18, we skip through verse 19 and 20 and read verse 21 again, it seems like a much smoother reading, which suggests that 19 and 20 comes from a different source and it's been put in between the one source. Now, you can go read that for yourself and have a look at that. But the interesting part here is that later in chapter 18, now that's like, it's 14 chapters later, when we read about Moses coming back to Midian, his sons seem to have never left in the first place. Although here in chapter 4:20, it's clear that he leaves with his sons. Now, this is another indicator that we're dealing with multiple sources, and that the one oral tradition was that they never went with them, and the other one was that they did. And when you put the two stories together, they are contradicting each other. Okay, now noticing these type of contradictions, multiple traditions in the story of Exodus might not be significant at first. Someone notices them or tells or makes you aware of them. But I tell you that they have truly changed my life, and they've changed the way in which I approach the entire Bible. Because the reality is, in my study of the book of John, the fourth gospel, it seems like even in that book, there's multiple sources that get put together and weave together. For instance, in the farewell discourse that we have in John, which is unique to the Gospel of John, by the way, it's not found in Matthew, Mark, or Luke. There's from chapter 13 to 18, a very long discourse around the Last Supper table, at which no communion or bread is served, interestingly enough. But there seems to be also a repetition of ideas, a repetition of the idea of the Holy Spirit that would come and that they'd be persecuted, etc., etc. And then some real discontinuities. For instance, like Paul and Thomas, I think, Peter and Thomas asked Jesus, where are you going? And then 5 verses later, Jesus says, and none of you ask me, where am I going? Huh? Like, something is not right there. And doing theological gymnastics around these issues do not solve them. The simple solution is that we're dealing with multiple sources of what happened on that night. And when they are weaved together, put together, they actually seem to now and again be in tension with one another. Sometimes they feel like they contradict one another, like in the last example I've mentioned. But that the redactor of the Gospel of John, the fourth Gospel, it's important enough for him to keep both these traditions in the text and put them nicely together where he believes they belong, and maybe it's the best place he could have placed them. But it's quite obvious that we are dealing with literary seams within this work, which tells us that whoever the writer of the Gospel of John was is using, more than one source at least, to put the work together. So we find this all over the Bible. And the more we recognize it, and the more we recognize it for what it is, the more it helps us to understand what the Bible actually is. To come out from the dogmatic view of the Bible, which is just a theological presupposition that only one author wrote this and God moved his hand, and he just wrote every word God said. That's not what's going on in the Bible. The Bible is a literary composition, and it's put together by people that took oral traditions about Moses, about Jesus, and put it together. And we're thankful that they did. How else would we know about Jesus? How else would we know about the history of, for instance, the Israeli people, unless we have some source to move to? So we're thankful that they did, but we shouldn't run from the truth that these books are literary compositions that are put together by people from many oral traditions. Let me leave that at that point. So anyway, it seemed here that Moses' son goes with, but in chapter 18, when he gets back to Midian, they never left. And if you pick that up, this is why it is like that. It's not because or you just don't understand the Bible. Really going on is two sources here that you've made some mistake or contradict each other, right? Okay. So let's move on. Another interesting thought here is that the Gospel of Matthew quotes this section, go back to Egypt, for all those who are seeking your life are dead. Almost in verbatim here in Matthew 2:20, in almost verbatim of that which we find in verse 19 of Exodus 4, which says, go back to Egypt, for all those who are seeking your life is dead. And here this brings up another interesting concept I think I want to spend a bit of time on today. I've just drawn an analogy of how the book of John, in terms of multiple sources and literary seams, also suits the way in which Exodus was put together. It's literary seams, multiple sources. Now, another thing that we have spoken about in a session or two ago is that most probably the birth narrative of Moses is built on an ancient heroic archetype of the priestly boy that his life is under threat. He gets thrown into the river in an ark, a little, a basket with tar, and it's sealed up. And then somebody else raises this boy and he becomes a prophet and goes and delivers his people. Moses is not the first person that this type of story is told about. There are multiple stories along these lines in the ancient Near East. The closest one, as we said, was Sargon the Great. You can look it up yourself and see how strikingly similar the birth narrative of Moses and that of Sargon the Great might be. The point is that the writers of Exodus didn't have any information about the birth of Moses, and they had to write something in, and they used an ancient archetype to show the reader of Exodus what a great man Moses will be. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make next is the writer of the book of Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, uses almost verbatim this idea that when Jesus was in Egypt, because Herod wanted to kill the babies, and specifically he killed the babies in around Bethlehem, but he wanted to kill Jesus. An angel appeared to Joseph and they went to Egypt. And there in Egypt they stayed until Herod died. And when Herod died, an angel appeared again to them and said, look, let me just read it here verbatim here. Go back to Egypt. No, I've lost it now. Where is it? It's safe to return home, for those seeking the child's life are dead. So there's a parallel here between the life of Moses and Jesus. So this is a little bit extra information, doesn't really fit in Exodus, but I think it's important to note at this point. When we go to the New Testament, we have the Gospel of Mark, Matthew, and Luke, and then we have a very much later Gospel John probably in the early 90s, 95, 80, 60 years after the life of Jesus, right? But our earliest testament of the life of Jesus doesn't have a birth narrative. This is the Gospel of Mark. Zero birth narrative. Jesus appears at his baptism, right? It boggles the mind why Mark would not write down the birth narrative, the miraculous birth narrative of Jesus by a virgin, especially seeing that the reason why Mark was writing is to prove to people that he was the Son of God. It stands to reason that Mark didn't have any information on the fact that Jesus was, or on the idea that Jesus was born by a miraculous birth. So what do we have on the miraculous birth? Because John really doesn't say anything about it either. And not even Paul writes about a virgin birth. That's interesting. And Paul is even earlier than Mark. So our earliest sources don't talk about a virgin birth. So where do we get this idea from? Well, we do get it from Matthew and Luke. Writers of Matthew and Luke probably writing in the 8th century, or the 8th century, the 8th decade after CE, Common Era, and they both have birth narratives of a virgin birth, and they agree on many points in their birth narratives. For instance, that Jesus was born from a virgin named Mary, and that Mary's husband's name was Joseph, and that Jesus was born in Bethlehem and that he grew up in Nazareth. Those things they agree on. But the almost said horrific thought, but the sobering thought is that that's all they agree on. If you go read these two birth narratives, every other detail in these birth narratives are completely different. They are two completely different stories, and as much as you try to reconcile them, the historical datum points they give, the census by Caesar and the death of Herod, it doesn't allow you to put them in any form of historical harmony. So the point I'm trying to make is that where does Matthew and Luke get their birth narratives from? So scholars have long known that Matthew seems to be writing his birth narrative about Jesus based on the life of Moses. And just very quickly, right? Moses brings the people out of Egypt. He goes into the wilderness. Then they go through the Red Sea. They go through the wilderness for 40 years, and then they also go to the mountain of the Lord. So wilderness from Egypt, they go through the Red Sea into the wilderness to the mountain where they get the law, and then they're on their way to the promised land. And Matthew, very different from Luke, writes a very similar story about the life of Jesus. Jesus has to go to Egypt. Wow, okay. Luke says nothing about that. Jesus has to go to Egypt because Herod wants to kill him. But then when he comes out of Egypt, eventually he arrives at the waters of baptism many years after that. And he has to go through the waters of baptism. All right. It's a picture of the Red Sea. Paul even speaks of it like in those terms. Then after that, where does Jesus go? For 40 days and 40 nights into the wilderness to be tempted. This is exactly kind of what happened to Moses and the Israelites. But then the most significant part of this is something that's also unique to Matthew. It's not found in Mark and it's not found in John or in Luke, is Matthew has a Sermon on the Mount, a mount where he reinterprets the law to people and gives his laws to the people. And there we find the Beatitudes, the antithesis, and some of his stronger speakings against the Pharisees, etc., etc. So the point is that this form of using older heroic narratives to add value to the lives of later heroes is something the Bible does all the time. And so I've said all of that just to make you aware of the fact that Matthew actually uses this Egypt, water, wilderness, mountain theme to build the birth narrative of Jesus. And the surprising thing is if you go to Luke, there's no Egypt and there's no mountain. And that's strange that he wouldn't have that. But anyway, let's move on. So back to Exodus. God hardens Pharaoh's heart against the effectiveness of the wonders that will be performed. So that initially what happens is he won't let people go, right? But then later on, when Pharaoh wants to let them go, here around plague 7 or 8, he actually wants to let them go. But God told Moses a long time ago, and the narrative reads in this way, that God then actually hardens Pharaoh's heart so that he decides not to let them go, so that God can punish him more. And then after that, the next plague, Pharaoh wants to let them go, but God hardens his heart so he doesn't, so God can punish him more. This happens a couple of times until, in the end, the big punishment, possibly twofold, but at least in the plague number 10, where the firstborn children of the Israelites, of the Egyptians, all die. In maybe the same way, tit for tat, eye for an eye, in the way that the Egyptians killed the baby boys of the Israelites. Now, it's this level of kind of vindictiveness in the Exodus narrative that makes a lot of people uneasy. And I have to be honest, it made me incredibly uneasy when I read this for what it said. Because really what I have here is I'm dealing with a question: who is responsible for Pharaoh's reluctance and the death of all those kids? If Pharaoh actually did want to let them go, but God overrode his will and therefore killed all the children. To me, it's a moral problem. I don't know who's to blame, but if I took Exodus for what it says, God is to blame because he hardened the heart of Pharaoh so that he can show himself strong. It's just a level of vindictiveness that me and you would scorn today. Like if we had a pastor that acted like this in our church, or a politician that acted like this, that could do this, had the power to do this to someone, like go over and override their will and punish them then for the decisions that they wanted them to make, it's a moral problem. Like very few people would use that. Now, there are some people that probably would swing that magic wand, but most people I know would say that's wrong. You can't do that to people. You can't override their will and then punishment for the decision you make for them. It doesn't work like that. And I want to jump briefly back into the New Testament just for a moment, because I'm also connecting things as I'm reading. I'm busy reading from a book called Lost Christianities, and it deals with all the versions of Christianity that were alive in the early 2nd century, 3rd century, maybe very late 1st century. A lot of these Christianities we don't have much information from because their books were burned and their books weren't allowed into the canon, and they were called heretics, etc. But we've found a lot of documentation on what they believed and how they saw things, etc., etc. But there were one group, the Marcionites. The Marcion was born, I believe it was 85 AD. Like that's before the Gospel of John was written. That's in the time that Matthew and Luke was written, more or less. And he died, I think, 160 AD. So really, really early. Marcion came to the conclusion, of course, Marcion didn't have the New Testament Gospels yet, as there was no canon, there was no Bible, nobody could refer to. But as far as I know, from what I've understood, Marcion had a version of Luke and the writings of Paul. And Marcion came to the shocking conclusion, and it was truly shocking for the Christians of his age, that the God of the Old Testament was not the Father of Jesus, right? That this is the thing he's famous for, and why he was later declared to be a heretic. But don't think it was just a little fringe sect on the side. They gained very, very strong following. I think it's Asia Minor, speaking on correction, but up until the 5th century, that's a long time, church fathers were still writing against him, which they wouldn't have done if it wasn't a threat back then, or at that late stage. But Marcion came to the conclusion that he was a big follower of Paul, but came to the conclusion that the God of the Old Testament could not have been the Father of Jesus. And the reason why he said this is he looked at how the God of the Old Testament acted. And then he looked at the life of Jesus and he said, I can't reconcile these two things. I can't reconcile them. Now, I am not a Marcionite, that I can promise you, because he also believed a lot of other stuff I don't agree with. But there is something to be said for the guts it took to make a statement like this. Someone that as early as the 2nd century, like guys, it's really, really early. someone started noticing, but wait a minute, the stories we have about Jesus and his life, they don't match the character of the God of the Old Testament. Now, about 10 years ago, I started noticing when I read the Old Testament, these type of moral problems like this one I've just mentioned, popping up, and I'm like, I just can't overlook them anymore. I need to face them, and I need to think about them, and I need to see where they lead me. Um, and I think a lot of people have actually done this. And if you speak to people that are maybe not Christians, this is one of the things that really bothers them, is the character of the God of the Old Testament. And I wanted to say this is not a new problem. This is something that comes from the 2nd century already. And that's just the Marcionites. There were also the Gnostics. It was a very widespread group. But this was also a group that had at the base this idea that the God who made this world is not the one only spirit origin of everything, because look at the mess. And look at what this God of the Israelites did. Genocides, this, that. This can't be the one true good. Like, obviously, they were very influenced by Greek philosophy, the Greek dualism of the Greco-Roman time. But the point is, very early on in our history of religion, we already have people that are noticing the things that maybe you've been watching, you've been following with me for the couple of sessions, maybe a year or so, and maybe you also are starting to realize that there's some stuff in here we can't say is good. It's not good. It's not how we want the world to be. It's not how we see God today. And I just want to say to you, you're not alone. People have been doing this for almost 2,000 years. People have noticed that there's something wrong with the Old Testament scripture and the way that God acts. So I want to say, just categorically, before we move on, for those of you who are saying, but what now? I think it's important that we realize, as we read the Old Testament, we're starting to realize this is a book put together by men. And what we have is the perspectives of people on God, right? In other words, we don't have God writing about God. We have people writing about God in the way they could understand. And that's the reason why Old Testament pictures God like a warrior of some type of tribal warlord that goes after his enemies with a vindictiveness that's not matched anyway, with a vengeance that borders on the annihilation of complete people groups. In a moment, we're going to be talking about God attacking one of the sons of Moses at night, wanting to kill him. What? Maybe you've just read over this portion, but I most certainly have, because I never understood it. But let's just go straight into it, so we can get straight into what's going on here. So Exodus gets really weird in verse 24 of this chapter. Moses is on his way back to Egypt, and he stops for a rest. Now everything seems to be going fine. Moses is obeying God, is going back. He's gonna talk to the elders, they're gonna get into Egypt, etc., etc. And then suddenly God tries to kill him in the night. Now, if you read from verse 23 to 24, please go and do this, because you're not gonna see what I'm saying unless you read it for yourself. It's like everything is fine and they went for a rest, and then God tried to kill him. What? Who? Who's God trying to kill? It doesn't tell us immediately. Like, who's he killing? Like, at night, God attacks someone. It's really, really puzzling. We're not really sure at first who God is trying to kill. Is it Moses? Is it one of his sons? Is it one of his servants? We don't really know, right? And the other question is, why? Why does God just want to kill someone? Talk to Moses, let Moses talk to the person. Is God really like this, that he'll come down from wherever you are trying to kill people? Answers seem to be implied in verse 25, because all these literally two verses, 24 and 25, says Zipporah, which is the wife of Moses, took a knife and she cut off her son's foreskin. So it seems like God wanted to kill the son of Moses because he wasn't circumcised. And then when Zipporah saw this, I don't know if she saw God coming to kill him. I don't know what's going on here. But she took a knife to her son and started cutting off his foreskin, basically, right? Which son? It doesn't say. It doesn't even say. We're assuming it's his son because the foreskin's being cut off. So it says there, and Zipporah touches someone's feet with the foreskin she just removed. Now, it is also just important to notice that feet in the ancient Exodus, it could be a euphemism for someone's penis, right? But we don't know whose feet. We don't know whose foreskin. We don't know what's going on. 2 little verses in here. It's also oh, I've already said that. And then she says to presumably Moses, truly you are a bridegroom of blood to me. This is all really disjointed. It's really confusing. And it completely interrupts the flow of the story. After verse 25, everything goes back to normal. But some author of the redactor, the editor of Exodus, believed that this is a portion, these 2 verses is important. We need to get these 2 verses into the Bible. We need to get it into the story of Exodus. We'll talk about why that might be important, but my word, talk about an insertion of a separate story without explanation, introduction, conclusion. Just God comes down to kill this boy. To be honest with you, I just don't see this to be God, which means either the writer is making the story up, or they misunderstood the story or the events completely. And at the same time, that tells us that we can't just take things from Exodus and literally apply them as the actual historical truth. Because the conclusions we'd have to come to about what type of God it is that we trying to follow, it's horrific. And this is not the first time God attacks someone at night. If you remember Jacob in Genesis 32, I mean, the man's lying down. He's about to meet his brother the next day, who's probably going to take his life. It's the most anguishing time of his life, trying to reconcile with a murderous brother that probably want to kill him. What happens? God comes and fights him. He attacks him at night. He attacks him so much that Jacob could never walk again. What the heck is going on here? Why does God attack people at night? Now, I'll put it to you that these are stories, that this is not really what happened. Yeah, I just can't fathom how this could be true in any way. That the God of the universe, the God most Christians believe in today, would waste his time to come down to earth and do a wrestling match and a murderous, like it's first degree murder on the son of Moses. No, these are stories and they're there for a reason. Now let's get back to in Jacob's case, of course, this is to tell of the great encounter Jacob had where his name was changed into Israel. That's a huge moment and it needs a big story, and there it is. But here in Exodus, when God attacks the son of Moses, we presume, what's the point of this, right? Some scholars suggest that this little account is included because it makes sense in light of the final plague. What happens in the final plague is that the sons of Israel would also have been killed by God, right? The angel of death, in brackets, God, which puzzles me already, if they didn't have blood on their doorstep. What? You're telling me that putting blood on my doorstep is going to stop God from killing my son? And if I don't put blood on my doorstep, he's going to kill my son because he is enraged by the Egyptians? Like, the story just, it's really difficult to process. But anyway, we'll get to that at a later point. The point is here that scholars believe the writers included this strange little episode because it adds weight to the idea that later on God would kill everyone who didn't have blood on their doorstep, all the firstborns. And so this is a prefigure to some degree of that account, and that God was serious about killing people who didn't follow his rules. I know you probably, as me, have read this with desensitive eyes for a very, very long time. I've decided to stop. I want to read it for what it says and see where it leads. Right. So, the firstborn sons of the household that's not protected by the blood will die. So the shedding of blood protects the firstborn in both moments in the story of the killing, the potential killing of Moses' son, but also the potential killing of every son of the Israelites and the actual killing of every firstborn of the Egyptians. It's just so weird to me. Like, I want to ask you, as a modern day Christian, like, how does it feel to know, or does it make sense to you that you serve a God who attacks people at night? It doesn't make any sense to me. It just doesn't make any sense to me anymore. And that helps me to understand that Exodus it's theological writing. It makes theological points. And if these events, if this particular event, verse 24 and 25, actually happened, it is a complete misinterpretation of what actually happened there that night. Maybe a bear came in there or a lion or something, and they later on said, but we think God sent the lion because my son wasn't circumcised. And after 700 years of retelling of the story went like this, and God came to kill. But I quickly cut off his foreskin and he was saved. I don't know, but to take this literally, like God comes down from wherever, just and come and try and kill people. I don't know, guys. Doesn't make any sense to me. All right. Anyway, so we're going to stop there today. Next week, we're going on to Moses' meeting with Pharaoh and with the elders. The first meeting with the elders and the first meeting with Pharaoh. There's a huge task on his head here. It's dangerous, right? It's a serious business. He almost lost his own son because he didn't follow the proper rules. So God means business, and this business he's going to offload on the Egyptians, and they're going to be sorry they ever touched Israel. All right. Now, ending there today. Thank you so much for joining me. Next week, Sunday, we'll continue in session 6. First meeting with the elders, first meeting with Pharaoh. Have a great day. Cheers.